It's already 15 minutes in, so it's okay.
Uh-huh.
Let's see. Did it record? Yep. All right. Welcome to the Real Estate Investing Education Club at Intel. Today is December the 17th, 2021. And if you've been investing in real estate for the past 2 years, you see an incredible appreciation, incredible asset inflation going on in the market out there. And so we're going to continue to bring in great speakers and educators, and Mike Wolf is one of those. Mike, you were recommended to me by Misi Liu, who runs the Walmart Real Estate Club. I guess you recently spoke over there. I don't know, but she highly recommended you and said you could teach us about tax deeds. And somebody
Absolutely.
in this group recently asked for that, so
Oh,
boom,
good.
here you are.
Oh, perfect. Well, I appreciate you having me, and I appreciate Nisi giving me a good review. And I'm happy to teach taxis and also, some of the other great strategies that are working right now. Because obviously, there's been a lot of change in the market since COVID started, and it's shut down some opportunities and it's opened up some others. And so, tax deeds is definitely one of them that is benefiting from what's been going on. So happy to explain all that. And I'm not sure if you want to do like a Q&A, if you want me to just go and present and teach, or what works best.
Sure. Or we could have a dialogue, whatever, people can open up their mics. We're going to keep it informal today. This is our last event of the year. We've done, I think, officially 49 this year.
Oh, wow. Good for you.
So we
That's
didn't quite
awesome.
hit that 50 mark, but but I'm also ready for a break too, and I'm
There
sure
you
everybody
go.
here is.
Yeah. So I'll
Um,
give background on myself first of all, and let you know kind of how I got to this point. And but we're open for questions anytime. Feel free. I'm much more familiar with Zoom, so some of you might have to tell me how to, if they're not verbal, if there's a chat box or something.
I could read the questions off to you.
Okay,
That's no problem.
that will make my life easy. I know you guys are all probably a lot more techy than I am if you're at Intel. But in any case, I got into real estate around 32 years ago by mistake, and I would consider that a really good mistake. Originally, I was going to school to live my parents' dream for me, which was for me to be a lawyer. Not really ever my dream per se, but when I was younger, I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so went to university, got my first degree, and with that came a whole bunch of student loans. And I thought, you know what, before I go back to school, get my next degree, I want to get these things paid off. And so I got a job at the phone company, which happened to be union. It paid really, really well. It was government run back in those days. And while I was there, I bought my first principal residence. And shortly after I did that, my mortgage broker calls me up and goes, Mike, if you want, I can get you another mortgage if you want to buy another home. And at that point, that seemed like the strangest thing ever. Like, I'm a single guy. Why do I need another home? And so he explained to me, well, you buy another property, you put a tenant in there, they pay off your mortgage, and down the road, 25 years from now, your mortgage is paid off, and that's your retirement. I go, that kind of makes sense. So I did that. I bought a second property. The only due diligence I knew back in those days was I wanted to buy something pretty and it was close to where I lived, so it was easy to collect the monthly check. Do not ever use that as your criteria, by the way. Don't say Mike said, because I would never recommend that. But that's all I knew how to do. And luckily things worked out pretty good, because a couple of years after I bought that, the market took off, and all of a sudden I was sitting on quite a bit of equity, especially for somebody who was an university student. Anyway, I did what most people would do back then. I was in my early to mid 20s. And so I went and I remember telling my mother, you know what? I finally found something I love. I'm going to be a real estate investor. I'm not going back to law school. And my mother begged me. She said, Mike, get that second degree so you have something to fall back on. You can always get back into real estate. And I told her, nope, I've got this. And I thought I knew everything there was to know about real estate. So I quit my job at the phone company. I don't recommend you do that either. And then I realized, okay, well, I got really lucky on this first deal. Of course, I didn't think it was luck. At that point, I thought I was God's gift to real estate, and I thought I knew everything there was to know. And anyway, to make a long story short, I quit my job at the phone company. I took the equity from my properties, bought another one using the same criteria as the first time, pretty home, close to where I lived. But this time, I didn't want to wait. That was a 2-year period before the market took off. I didn't want to wait 2 years. I needed to get some cash flow. And, the strategy that made me that money over that 2-year period did not did not work and did not turn into a paycheck. Matter of fact, I took a pretty big loss. And so, unfortunately, after that, I had already burnt the bridge at the phone company. I couldn't really go back looking for my job back. And I was too proud as a kid in his, 20s. I did not want to tell my mother she was right, that I should have got that second degree. So I knew I had to figure real estate, how to do this, or I'd have to admit to her she was right. And I really didn't want to do that. And so hired a mentor who was successfully flipping homes in the market I was in. And I wouldn't say the rest is history where every deal's gone smooth, but I've certainly had a lot more successes than failures. So anyway, fast forward, that was, 30 some odd years ago, 32 years ago that I got my start. And since then, I have taken a lot of opportunities to educate myself on a whole bunch of different strategies. Some of them are very popular strategies like flipping. I'm sure you guys have spoken about flipping and wholesaling and maybe subject to and all that. But I've also learned some less well-known strategies. And one of them is tax deeds. Tax deeds are it's not that they're not known. I would say they're misunderstood. And there's a lot of false information out there on that topic. And so I'm gonna tell you some of the do's and don'ts, and I'm also gonna tell you some other strategies that tie in really well to that strategy that you can be doing right now. So as we all know, obviously COVID shut down a lot of things over the last few years. A lot of people lost their jobs, lost their businesses. Now, what a tax deed is, first of all, when somebody hasn't paid their property taxes in a number of years, it doesn't happen. If you're one day late on your tax, they're not going to take your home away from you. But if you're 2, 3, 4 years without paying your property taxes, eventually the county needs that money to pay for their hospitals, their schools, their police, their fire department, etc. And that is one of the remedies that they've got. Now, there's two different things that a county will do. Every county in the United States has a different way that they deal with it. There's two main ones. One of them is called the tax lien, and one is a tax deed. And I want to really differentiate those two because a lot of people use those terms interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. And so a tax lien, the county, basically, let's say I didn't pay my property taxes. I got something in the mail saying, Mike, your property taxes are due on July 1st. You owe $1,000. And if you're late, there's a 20% penalty. And that penalty, by the way, will vary from location to location. So July 1st comes and goes. I don't make my payment. And now instead of owing $1,000, I now owe $1,200. So the county at this point, unbeknownst to me, goes and sells what's called the tax lien. Now, what that means is somebody else, an investor, can go and pay the $1,000 that I did not pay, give that to the county, and then the county, they're going to keep hounding me for that $1,200. Once I pay, they're going to take that money, keep $1,000 for themselves, or sorry, actually they're not. They've already got the $1,000. They take that money and they're actually going to send it to you. And so suddenly one day you get this mailbox money. You check your mailbox. You paid $1,000 however long ago, and now there's a check for $1,200 in there. Now, it's obviously pays a lot better than what you would get leaving your money in the bank. So a lot of people like to do tax liens because you need a very small amount of money. I think they said the statistic is 80% of tax liens are under $1,000. So they're usually fairly small amounts. And so you don't need a whole lot to get started. Now, there's another part to the story. Now, first of all, I want you to keep in mind that in 98% of the cases, you're not going to end up with a piece of real estate. You're going to end up with a bigger check than what you put in. There is some exceptions, though. In every county, they have a limitation. It's called a redemption period. And let's say the redemption period is 1 year. So 1 year after you buy that lien, if I haven't paid my taxes and paid them back yet, now the county is basically going to stop chasing me, and they're going to give you the opportunity to foreclose on me and take my home. And so I don't know if any of you remember, but if any of you are old enough to remember, but back like in the 80s, it was either 80s or 90s, there used to be a commercial, and somebody would be, saying, I bought this home for $500. And that actually is true. You will see that once in a while, but that's normally not the case. Most people who owe only $500 are not going to lose their money over such a small amount of cash. And so the good thing about the tax liens is that you need very little to get started. The returns can be very high. The downside is, though, to actually get a piece of property, you have to foreclose on somebody. And the due diligence to make sure it's something you want to foreclose on it costs more than what you're going to make. And so let me give you an example. Let's use the same number. You put in your $1,000, you're going to get 1,200 back, but I don't actually ever pay that 1,200. And now you go and foreclose on me. And let's say the reason I stopped paying is because the land that my home is on there used to be a gas station there. Now the land is contaminated, and I'm trying to get somebody to take over my liability. So I want you to write this down. With ownership comes liability. So as soon as you take over that home, if let's say the cost to remedy the contamination is $50,000, that's now your responsibility, not mine anymore. And so you have to be really careful that whatever you're buying as a lien, that if you had to take over that property, you would want to. And as you can imagine, if you're only going to make $200 on it, it's not a great. I'm not a huge fan of liens for that reason. A lot of people do them and they just don't foreclose. And they make enough, the vast majority of time that they don't care. They won't foreclose on the property. I also have a friend. He runs a business where he buys these liens in bulk from the counties. He owns thousands of them, and he makes a good living. But most people that do this, they don't make a ton of money doing it. It's very slow, it's tedious, and in most cases, you're not getting a property. And quite often when you do, it's a piece of property you don't necessarily want. So the cousin to tax liens is tax deeds, and it's something that I greatly prefer. In a tax deed situation, you actually are getting the property, and you're going to get full ownership to that property. And most importantly, all the liens, such as mortgages, typically will get wiped out. So if let's say Bank of America, we'll say it's a $100,000 home, Bank of America has a $90,000 mortgage on it, they're going to get a notice from the county saying, hey, we're putting this home up for auction, and if you want to bail it out and pay the back taxes, no problem. But if you don't, it's going to go on the auction block. If Bank of America and the other lien holders don't pay off those arrears and it goes to auction, they get wiped out. They disappear. And when you get the property, you get a free and clear property most of the time. Now, there's some exceptions. And so I don't want anybody to go run to the auction tomorrow until you know what you're doing, because you can definitely lose your shirt at these auctions. You can also make a lot of money. And so, but in most cases, you're going to end up with a piece of property, free and clear, and you can do whatever you want with that property from that point. You can rent it, you can live in it, you can sell it. Now, there's a few things you need to know. One is that you're not going to, you get a different type of title. You don't get the same title as if you bought a property on the MLS, for example, because most title companies don't want to insure it because they don't really fully understand how tax deeds work, number one. And number two, in some places, there's something that's called a redeemable deed. And a redeemable deed means it's kind of like a cross between a lien and a deed, in that, okay, now you've gone to the auction, you're the high bidder, you get this property. And I'll use Texas as an example because that's one of my favorite markets. You get this property, let's say it was worth 100K, you got it for 30,000. Well, now the person who used to own that has a redemption period of 6 months in which they can come back and buy that property off of you again. And so they would have to, in order to do that, they've got to give you, this is in Texas, this is specific to Texas, they have to give you a 25% premium. So if you paid 30,000, they've got to give you your 30,000 back plus another 7,500. And if you do any what are called eligible expenses, meaning if you had to change the carpet, fix the roof, if you have to do anything to make the home safe and or livable, you keep track of all the money that you invested in that property, and the previous homeowner would have to give you a 25% premium on top of that. So there's obviously the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds are, oh, I'm going to put a ton of work into that property, so that if I get that 25%, I'm going to get this big chunk of cash. Don't do that unless it's a necessary expense. If, for example, you decide, oh, I'm going to put $100,000 chandelier in the property, you're not going to get anything because that's not an eligible expense. For it to be eligible, it has to be something to make the home livable, safe. It had to, if you replace the roof because it's going to cause further damage, obviously that's an eligible expense. If you start putting in fancy countertops and really nice appliances and chandeliers, if the owner comes back, they're not obligated to repay you for any of those things. So don't do that. So that's basically the liens, the deeds. And like I said, there's a few places that do redeemable deeds. Those places are Texas, Georgia, Hawaii, and I believe Connecticut. There might be one more. Now you have to be careful though, because in some places, like if you go to Georgia, for example, there's a 1-year redemption period. And what that means, during that time frame in Georgia, you're not allowed to do anything to the property. You can't fix it, you can't move into it, you can't rent it, you can't sell it. You just have to wait that year to see if the homeowner is going to come back and do anything with it. And in Georgia, it's a 20% redemption. But in most cases, people aren't going to come back. If they couldn't afford it now, they're very unlikely to come up with all that money plus another 20% or 25% in Texas to ever redeem it. It usually doesn't happen, but in the meantime, it's all tied up and you can't do anything with it in Georgia. So one of my favorite market to do this in, I personally love the Houston, Texas area for this. One, there's not that much. There's definitely competition. You're not going to ever be the only person at that auction, I guarantee it. But there's not a lot of institutional investors. When you go to places like Florida and Vegas and California, we see a lot of institutional money there, and you can't really compete against them. They need much smaller margins because they have billions of dollars of other people's money quite often. Quite often you're competing against hedge funds and banks and people with a lot more resources than we have. And so you're rarely going to win. In Texas, for whatever reason, and I think the reason is that because of those, it being a redeemable deed and that the homeowner having a 6-month period to come back, most institutional investors, they just want to own that property like right now. And so they tend to not compete in that market. There's a really decent supply, and even more so if you consider that all the auctions were shut down over the past year and a half. A lot of them are reopened now, but they were shut down for a year and a half. They have a lot of backlog. And so if we look at Houston specifically, typically in a typical month,
Did
Did
I
we
just
lose
lose
his
the
audio?
sound?
Yeah, the sound
Yeah.
just cut out.
Hey, Mike, you are muted.
Looks like someone here.
Oh,
There,
let me see
have
if I can. Okay,
where
great.
did I lose you guys?
If you went to Houston, for instance, I think is what you said.
Okay, yeah. So if you go to, I got to make sure I get back to where I left off. I don't want to miss anything. Yeah. So if you go to Houston, a lot of your competition does not want to. A lot of the institutional investors don't want to go there because they don't like that 6-month redemption period. And in Texas, by the way, you can do whatever you want with that property during that 6 months. You can fix it, you can move into it, you can put tenants in there. And there's even ways that you could potentially flip it. Most people don't know that, but there actually are ways you can flip it. Most people think you have to wait for the end of the redemption period to do that. So I particularly like that market. It was closed for around 14, 15 months. And I don't know if you caught this part, but usually around 500, sometimes even 1,000 homes will change hands in a month. And so if you do the math, there are thousands and thousands of properties behind that they now have to liquidate. So it's a really good opportunity. Now, one of the things I love to teach is something that I call the trifecta of real estate, because a lot of people will take the list of homes that are going for auction, they'll do their research, they'll show up at the auction, and then, hopefully they win a property or two, but that's all they do. And that auction takes place only once a month. It's on the first Tuesday of every month. That's in all the big places in Texas, they're the first Tuesday of every month. And then after that, they don't do anything for the rest of the month. And if they don't get a property, they have no income, they have no cash flow, they have nothing for that whole month. So something that I recommend that you all do is, every month there's a list published, and you can actually find the list at publicans.com, PUBLICANS. That's actually it forwards you, I think it's lgbs.com now. It's a law firm that handles these foreclosures. They publish a list every single month, usually 3 to 4 weeks before the auction takes place. And that list, to me, one of the things that I love to teach real estate investors, our main job is we're really problem solvers. Nobody randomly puts a for sale sign on their lawn one day. There's always a story behind it. Either they're moving up, they're moving down, they've been transferred, they got a divorce. There's always a story behind it. In the case of the tax deeds, it's because people didn't pay their property taxes. So these people are extremely motivated because they're literally less than a month away from losing their home to auction. And so what I recommend is that you take that list and you do some marketing to them. Try to help them, try to create a solution, either helping them stay in their home or buying it from them pre-auction, if that makes sense. Doesn't always, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Back in the last recession, I set up a company called Foreclosure Fixers. And you know, hey, you're probably all either receiving or maybe some of you sent postcards to say, we buy homes, we buy ugly homes, we pay cash for homes. And those work. If you send out enough of them, you're eventually going to get calls off of it. Instead, I took the time to actually learn the foreclosure laws. I hired an attorney to teach me from start to finish how the foreclosure works. And I would send out pamphlets that said, I can help stop the foreclosure. And when you consider, when you send out a pamphlet like that, you're going to get a much higher response rate than we buy homes. And so I got two different types of people that would reach out to me off of that marketing. The first I like to call, sometimes bad things happen to good people. And I can't think of a time in history more so than now where a lot of good people that have never missed a mortgage payment, a credit card payment, a car payment in their entire life, all of a sudden when their business shut down, they had no choice. They couldn't make their payments. And so a lot of these people are unfortunately in trouble. Now, these are people that are typically good with money. They're people that have never typically had to struggle. And now they're in a tough spot. And so for people like that, I might go in and if maybe they got 10,000 behind in arrears and they weren't working, but now they are again. And they can afford the monthly payments. They just don't have that lump sum of $10,000. Well, quite often what I would do is I would loan them $10,000, pay off their debt to the county or the bank or whoever they owe that to. And I would actually stop the foreclosure. Now, of course, if you do that, you're going to charge interest and you're also going to do the proper paperwork to protect yourself. Because obviously, if these people are to lose their job again and they didn't pay you, you don't want to have to start the foreclosure process. So you're going to get them to sign what's called a quit claim deed. And a quit claim deed basically says that if they don't pay you, you have the right to foreclose. You're not going to do it if they're 1 day late. You're never going to do that to somebody. But you're going to say, hey, if you get 2 months behind, I'm taking over your home. And they're actually giving you permission to do that without going through the entire foreclosure process. So for people like that, I would sometimes do that. Sometimes they just were, they were depressed. They just wanted to get away from that house because it just had bad karma and bad memories for them. And quite often, in that instance, I would either buy it or if you don't have a lot of money and you want to be able to help them, you can wholesale it. I'm sure you guys have probably spoken about wholesaling at one of your numerous meetings. But in any case, you want to come up with a solution that's a win for them and that's also a win for you. And so that's the first type of person that would call off the ads. The second type of person, these are people that live beyond their means. And it didn't take a pandemic for them they would have been behind pandemic, no pandemic, boom, bust. They have a house that they could barely afford. Usually they have a nice, I'd show up at their property. They have a nicer car than me, better TV, better stereo. These are people that live beyond their means. And people like that, you never want to loan them money because you're giving them a Band-Aid and they're going to burn through your money. Not only are they going to still lose their home, but they're not going to pay you back. And so for people like that, I do what I call a soft landing. I'd always want to leave them in a better spot than when I met them. And so quite often I'd be sitting across from somebody who I knew was totally desperate, would take absolutely, next to nothing because they knew they were going to lose their home. And instead, I would always make sure that they had, money for a damage deposit and several months rent, money for food. And I'd also give them some education on how they could get back into real estate and buy something more affordable. If I had another property that was cheaper, I would sometimes do a rent to own for them. I'd always try to leave them in a good spot because a lot of these people literally would be homeless or they'd be having to stay at a friend's place or relative's place. And so there's a lot of things you can do to help these people before they ever lose their home. So that's the first part of the trifecta. The second part is actually going to the auction. We obviously can't help every single person. A lot of people won't reply to us. A lot of people we can't track down. So a lot of these homes, we're not single-handedly going to end the auctions, unfortunately. And so we're actually going to do our homework, go to the auction, hopefully get a really good deal there. Some of my students have got, one of them got a single-family home worth probably between $90,000 and $100,000 conservatively, and he got it for $7,200. There was actually a tenant still in there when he got it. They were paying $900 a month rent back then. I'm sure it's a lot higher now. And he just kept the tenant. So you can do the math. You pay $7,200 and you have $900 of rent. It doesn't take long to recoup your investment in the property. And so part two is picking up homes at the auction. And then the third part of the trifecta, and very few people know about the strategy, even very sophisticated investors, it's not very well known, and that's called overages. And in some places it's called surplus funds. And what that is, at the auction, if a home starts off, let's say at $5,000, it always starts off at whatever the back taxes are, plus any legal fees that they've incurred. And so let's say it starts off at $5,000 and the home ends up selling for $50,000. Well, that first $5,000, that belongs to the county fair and square. That's the back taxes. That additional $45,000 actually belongs to the previous homeowner. And most previous homeowners are not going to the auction. They don't, last thing I want to see is a home that they spent $100,000 on, sell to somebody else for $10,000. So they have their head buried in the sand. They're not paying attention. And on top of that, the county makes very little attempt to get these people their money, because there's a statute of limitations. And once that statute runs out, the county gets to keep that money in their slush fund, do whatever they want with it. And so there's a lot of people, literally billions of dollars owed to, taxpayers, and people maybe got behind on their property taxes, but there's billions of dollars all across the United States that's unclaimed. And so a really cool strategy is to go and track down these people, whether you win at the auction or not. Whether, obviously at that point, if it went to auction, you couldn't help them in the first part of the trifecta, but whether you won the property or not, you can participate in this third part. And that's being a little bit of a detective, trying to find out how to get a hold of these people. And then basically saying, hey, you know what? I know somebody owes you $45,000. If you're willing to give me 10%, 20, 30, 40, whatever you guys negotiate, you get to keep that. And you're going to help them do the paperwork and help them retrieve that money. Most of the time, they have no idea this money is coming to them. And imagine you just lost your home over a very small amount of money, like $5,000. You just lost your home over $5,000. A portion of that $45,000 is going to change your life at that point. It might mean the difference between being homeless and having a roof over your head. And so it's a really great strategy. It's a great win-win. And I know there's a lot of probably heart-centered people on this call, and I'm one of them too. So if you make enough money doing part one and part two, instead of taking, you might just want to contact these people and let them know, hey, here's how you go find this money that's owed to you. But you can absolutely turn this into a business as well, depending on what you want to do. And so that's some of the stuff that I really recommend. With where the market is right now, we're going to see more and more foreclosures. We're going to see in Texas in particular, the property taxes are extremely high. They tend to be 2.6 to 3% in that ballpark. So $300,000 home has somewhere around $8,000 or $9,000 in property taxes a year. So unlike other places where the taxes are low, where people can get caught up, once you get a little bit behind, it's very difficult for people to unbury themselves from that. And so that's kind of the basics, but that's what I'd be focusing on, because so many people, when they talk about tax deeds, all they think about is that auction, and they don't realize there's a whole strategy around the pre-foreclosure, and also what happens after the auction. There's still a way to monetize it and also create a win, because as I mentioned, we're problem solvers. So there's a lot of other ways to solve those problems besides just going to the auction. And so I should probably take some time for questions, because I know I covered a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So does anybody have any questions that I can answer?
And feel free just to take yourself off mute. You don't have to put it in the chat box.
Yeah, I just had one question. So when we're talking about tax deeds, buying these homes from these people who didn't, pay property taxes at these auctions, are all these auctions 100% cash offers?
In most cases, now they vary from county to county. If you're dealing in Texas, you have to either have cash or cashier's checks physically on you. So if you're the high bidder, you can't say, hey, I'm just going to go to my bank and get the money, or hey, I'm going to get financing. You have to physically have that money on you. And that's another reason why I like that auction, because a lot of times in places where you can have a certain amount of due diligence period or time to get funding, a lot of those deals end up selling, but they never actually change hands, and they show up again the next month. With this, people don't have the cash, can't compete against you, and they're not tying up the properties. But in most places, and I always recommend calling the county first. In most places, they do want something like cash or cashier's checks. Usually they don't have a whole lot of other options. There's a few exceptions to that. But number one, always call up the county and first of all, ask where's the auction? When is the auction? Because they're not always the first Tuesday like they are in Texas. And what are the acceptable forms of payment? And is there any time frame to get that money to you?
Okay.
Also want to know, do you have to register? Some auctions you have to register in advance. In Houston, you do not. In Houston, you can just show up the day of, fill out a piece of paper. They're going to give you a bidding card, and you're good. You're in the system, and you can go without it. But I think even in San Antonio, just down the road from Houston, you have to register, I believe, 48 hours in advance, or you can't participate in the auction. And so the other thing I'll tell you is that because you're bringing cash or cashier's checks, they don't make change, because there's obviously a lot of fraudulent cashier's checks out there. And so they wait for that to clear before they send you your change, and that could take 6 to 8 weeks. So imagine you bought a home for 10,000, you had a cashier's check on you for 100,000. You're gonna get the property, but then you're gonna have $90,000 tied up that you won't be able to use at the next auction, most likely. So try to have as close to exact change as possible. So have, you know, if you had $100,000, bring some $20,000 cashier's checks, 10,000, 5,000, some $1,000 cashier's checks. I'd probably bring some cash, like $1,000 in cash, so you can make pretty much exact change. So you have to be really careful of that. I don't know of any auction that will ever give you your change right there on the spot.
And do they take the actual check itself, like just a bank check?
No, it has to be
cashier's.
Cashier's check is
Okay.
A check and balance, and so it has to be very liquid.
We've got a question from Keisha in the chat, and she says, so do you recommend buying these tax liens in Texas, even if you don't live there? And I'm actually going to broaden that question. Is this a business that you can do remotely, or do you need to be there present at the auctions?
Great question. So to me, I always do business where it makes the most sense. I don't live in Texas, just for the record. I'm a nomad. Right now I'm in Scottsdale. Yesterday I was in California, and next week I'm going to be in Mexico. So I'm a nomad, and I still do business where it makes the most sense, where it's most lucrative. Now, if you're doing that, obviously you have to have some teams on the ground. And so that's one of the things that I've done is I built a team. I have people that go to the auction on my behalf. I've got people that drive around and photograph the properties. I've got people that pull title. One of the things that I've become really good at over these years of being in real estate, if we had this conversation like 15, 20 years ago, I was a workaholic back then, and I thought I had to do everything. I realized that, you know, it's having financial freedom, but not time freedom, and not being able to hang out with your kids and grandkids and travel and volunteer, whatever it is that lights you up, not being able to do that and having money in your bank is very depressing. So I went from workaholic to playaholic. And one of the things that I did is I built teams in the places that I wanted to do real estate. And so you can absolutely, at least in Houston, you can have somebody go show up at the auction on your behalf. It doesn't have to be you. You're going to have to obviously make sure they know what they're doing, because if you have a bad team, you're going to lose your money. But yes, you can absolutely do it from afar. And I recommend, you know, and by the way, you said tax liens. You're not going to do a tax lien. I just want to clarify that. You're going to do a redeemable deed is what you're going to do anywhere in Texas. So after you buy the property, the previous owner can still come back. They've got 6 months. If they do come back, they're going to give you a 25% premium over what you paid. But to answer your question, you can participate from absolutely anywhere. I had a student who lived in Australia, and he used my team. So he was bidding from Australia and picking up properties at the Texas auction. So you can do this from anywhere. And the other piece to that equation is there's a lot more auctions that are starting to take place online. And there's some pluses to that, and that you can be anywhere and do it from your living room. The downside to that is, because you can do it from anywhere, there's a lot more competition. Somebody could be in Europe or Asia, and they could be participating in that auction, competing against you. And obviously, the more competition, the less properties you're going to get. So I do like these in-person auctions because there's a higher barrier to entry. But you can absolutely have somebody else show up for you on your behalf, at least in Texas. Other auctions, they may not allow somebody to bid by proxy for you. I don't know, because I've just had so much success in Texas that I haven't really needed to go to any other auctions besides Texas. I've done Houston and I do San Antonio. One of my students I know is very successful in Dallas. So between the different Texas auctions none of them are online as of yet, we're finding enough deals there that we don't have to go participate in a whole bunch of other auctions.
Mike,
We don't have any other questions in the chat. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question.
So I'm assuming the properties you cannot tour or kind of look inside and things like that. What are the criteria that you have for bidding on a given property, and what has been kind of your experience in terms of people gutting the property or things like that as having to do work?
Great question. Yeah, so a lot of these properties will need work, and when I was trying to learn this strategy, by the way, I took every course I could find. I read every book, and the more I read, the more confused I got because there's so much conflicting information. And one of the things, like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of myths surrounding this segment of the industry. So one of the things I'd say, I remember a lot of courses, they said, oh, you don't need to ever go look at the property. You can just look on, Google Maps and Zillow and look online. Well, those pictures could have been taken a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. So I would say that you need to take a look at every single property. Now, it doesn't have to be you. I've got somebody on my team who goes and photographs and videotapes, not just the home, but also the streetscape. Now, sometimes we can take a peek inside through the windows, other times not. And so I always err on the side of caution. I assume you can tell a lot also by the exterior of a property. If somebody's mowing the lawn, they're probably taking pretty good care on the inside too. If the roof doesn't, if it's in good shape and it looks like it's been replaced recently, probably the inside is going to look similar. But if the home is looking really ratty on the outside and there's weeds up to your knees and tarp on the roof, I usually will assume that the inside looks the same, if not worse. And so I'm always going to estimate what is going to be, one, I need to know what's the after repair value. Number two, I need to have an estimation of what the expenses are to fix up the property. And so one of the things I recommend is getting a contractor on the ground to give you an estimate per square foot to do just an average, like depending on the neighborhood. If you're buying in a really nice neighborhood, obviously you have to make it look really nice and have the nice finishings. But most of the bread and butter, or most of the properties that you're going to win, the prettiest homes, by the way, are the hardest to win because you're competing against people that want to move into the home. And they, of course, have an emotional attachment to the property, whereas as investors, we don't, or at least should not have that attachment. So it's very hard to get properties in the upscale neighborhoods. So when we go into more of a rental type neighborhood, if I was going to rent it, I'm going to make it rent ready. Rent ready means that it's clean, it's safe, but it's not going to look like the Taj Mahal. And so I'm going to get a contractor and I'm going to say, hey, to do this scope of work, what on average does it cost per square foot? And then I'm going to take the number of square feet, multiply by that, and assume that's what I'm going to need. And then I'm going to add another 20% on top of that just for all the miscellaneous things that are probably going to show up that you weren't expecting. Because I can tell you after this many years, almost every project goes over time and over budget. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that. So I'm going to add extra on top of that just to be a little bit safe. But I might take off a little bit if I can tell the home's really well cared for on the outside, because it's probably going to be decent on the inside. But if it's trashed, I'm going to assume it needs everything. And I'm going to err on the side of caution. And keep in mind, sometimes the best property isn't the one that you win, it's the one that you didn't get stuck with. And so, but that's one of the things I would do is you're going to want a contractor on the ground who's going to be able to give you estimates. If that person happens to also be your photographer, that's extra awesome because they're actually going to firsthand see the property. And so that's when you're building your team. That's one of the things that you ideally will do is you'll have your contractor or inspector be the person who's going and looking at the property beforehand. And usually, by the way, I'll give them, not only do I pay them for their work, but I'll also give them a piece of equity should I end up winning that property and making a paycheck off of it. And so, always, a lot of people, they go in and they always are trying to make a deal out of something that's not necessarily a deal, and they're trying to justify it. Don't do that. Always err on the side of caution, assume it needs more than it really does. And then if you get a surprise, it's going to be a good surprise as opposed to a bad surprise.
All right, we've got 5 more minutes in the meeting. Any other questions?
Are you usually buying these homes and then flipping them, or are you usually acquiring a greater proportion of them and then renting them out? Could you tell us about what your portfolio looks like, just maybe on the high level or medium level, anything that you want to share?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So when we talk about Texas, as I mentioned, they have high property taxes. And they also have high insurance, especially Houston, because they get hurricanes and storms like last year. So my favorite place to hold properties, by the way, is Atlanta. And Atlanta, as I mentioned earlier, Georgia is not a great place to do tax deeds. I don't buy them by tax deed there. I actually buy in bulk from the banks. Most of my rental properties are in Atlanta for that reason. Now, if I'm buying at the auction in Texas, I'm looking at certain factors to decide if I want to keep that as a rental property. Now, obviously, if you look at the property that my student got for $7,200, rents for $900 a month, even though you're paying higher property taxes, who cares? I mean, you got such a discount on that property. It's going to take a long time worth of property taxes and high insurance to make it not a good deal. And so things that I look at when I'm deciding is, what type of neighborhood is it in? We have what I call, and you may know this already, but we have A, B, C, and D neighborhoods. A is Beverly Hills. Those are usually not great places to own rental properties because it's usually old money. Most people own, they're not renting. And you're going to pay a big premium. And like I said, you're competing against people that want to move into the home. So you're going to pay a big premium to get that property. And at the end of the day, you're not going to get that much more rent than if you bought in the B neighborhood. So I'm not usually focusing on, if I get a really good deal in an A neighborhood, I'm usually going to flip it. Now there's at the other end of the spectrum, you have D neighborhood, and D stands for do not buy in that neighborhood, even for whether it be a flip or hold. Most of those homes they'll sell for super cheap, but they're only worth $30,000 or $40,000. And so if you need to put any kind of work into the property, which almost always you'll have to, there's no profit margin left. And so I avoid those neighborhoods. Now that leaves the B and C neighborhoods. And B and C neighborhoods in some ways look very similar to each other. A lot of times builders will build the exact same model in both those neighborhoods. The biggest distinction between a B and C neighborhood is a C neighborhood tends to have a lot more renters, and B neighborhoods tend to be a lot more owner occupied. And so one of the things that I've learned over my career is that if you can buy and hold properties in B neighborhoods, where when you go to sell it, you're most likely going to sell to somebody an owner occupant who's going to move into the property. You can make a lot of money doing that. When you buy in a rental neighborhood, you're almost always going to be selling that home to another investor, and you can still make money. It will still appreciate, but at the end of the day, I'd rather flip that and save my money for the B neighborhoods. Now, for any of you who are saying, "Oh, I can't really afford to hold it. I need to have that money come back so I can buy another one." Yeah, if you're in that position, just flip them and get on to the next deal. But eventually you want to start holding properties. It doesn't necessarily have to be in Houston, but if you're not buying properties to hold, I remember I had a conversation with a friend of mine. We used to flip a lot of properties back in the day. And, we would make 25, 30, 35,000 typically. And we thought we had hit the jackpot, especially back in the 90s. That was a lot of money. But we had a conversation. We met at Starbucks. He goes, "Mike, remember all those properties that we sold for, made 25 grand on, and we thought we were like God's gift to real estate? Don't you wish we still had those? Because all those properties are now worth 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 more than what we sold them." So every time you sell a property, you're selling the goose that laid the golden egg. Sometimes you have to. Back in the day when we were only flipping, we couldn't afford to hold them. We had to get that money come back in. And so if you're in a position where you can only flip, it's a great place to do it, is at these auctions. Make sure you know what you're doing, though.
Hey, Mike, since we only have 1 minute left, can you give your contact information so that people can reach out to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's you can email me, mike@mikewolfmastery.com. And it's wolf just like the animal. So it's mike@mikewolfmastery.com. And you can go to my website as well, mikewolfmastery.com. And I've got there's a free ebook on there that talks about some of my favorite strategies. And it goes into more detail than I had time to do today. And I apologize once again for my technical difficulties, which is especially embarrassing when it's in front of Intel. But I'm happy to come back and continue if you ever need a speaker.
Hey, everybody, can you take yourselves off of mute? And thank you, Mike, for coming in and sharing with us today.
Thanks, Mike.
Hey,
Thank you
Mike,
so much,
you're
Mike.
awesome.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
You guys are
Merry
great.
Christmas.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks so much. So thanks for having me, and it's been a pleasure. Great questions, great audience. I'm impressed that you're all here on a Friday, and you're taking the time to learn. I think that's so important.
Thank you so much, Mike, and have a wonderful holiday.
Yeah, you too, and thanks a lot for having me. Have a happy New Year as well, everybody.
Have a happy New Year, everybody. We're going to be back here on the first week of January. So the next meeting will be then. Till then.
Bye.
Thanks.